Inside a nationally televised debate in Houston, Senator Ted Cruz praises Exxon, Valero, and Chevron as the heroes of Texas, claiming they fuel prosperity and jobs, while Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stares him down in icy silence. He tries to paint her as anti-business, but just minutes later, Jasmine unleashes leaked emails, cancer maps, and a $1.75 million donation trail, proving those same companies are killing poor Texans with toxic air while buying Cruz's silence. The crowd goes dead quiet. Cruz turns pale. America watches the truth explode live on air. If dirty money buys protection, how many kids had to die for a check? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the scorching lights of the Texas News Now studio, tension coiled in the air like a taut wire ready to snap. The set had been redesigned for maximum drama: burnished wood, bold crimson accents, and 3 massive vertical screens, looping aerial views of oil rigs, smokestacks, and bustling downtown Dallas, as if Texas's entire economy were on trial tonight. Center stage sat 2 desks, polished to a mirror shine, separated by 10 feet of silent, high-stakes distance. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "State of the State. Do big corporations help or harm Texas?" And just as that question lingered, unanswered, in the mind of every viewer, Ted Cruz entered stage right, smiling like a man walking into a victory lap. His pace was deliberate, his eyes scanning the audience like a seasoned litigator reading a jury. He adjusted his cufflinks, gave the cameras their moment, and took his seat without looking at Jasmine Crockett. Then he spoke, and his voice sliced clean through the silence. "Texas didn't become the engine of America by accident," he began, leaning slightly forward, hands folded like a preacher at the pulpit. "We opened our arms to industry, we reduced regulation, and as a result, we created more jobs than California, more freedom than Washington, and more prosperity than any liberal dream could ever imagine." Applause burst from the right side of the audience, mostly white men in oil-patch suits, their faces lined with comfort and calculation. One of them even winked at Cruz. The camera pivoted left, and there sat Jasmine Crockett, unmoved. Her tailored black blazer cut a sharp line under the harsh studio lights. In front of her, untouched, sat a thick dossier, 5 inches deep, bound in battered leather, its edges warped from use and time. Her hands rested on either side of it, calm but coiled, as if the weight of the truth it contained anchored her to something deeper than the spectacle unfolding around her. She didn't speak. She didn't shift in her seat, but her stillness carried more force than 100 sound bites. And just as the applause from Ted Cruz's opening remarks began to fade into a calculated hush, he leaned forward again, eyes gleaming beneath the studio lights like a man fully convinced of his own myth. "Let's talk about the real heroes," he said, voice smooth but rising with patriotic bravado. "The names they won't put in history books, but should." His hand sliced the air, firm and practiced, as if each name he was about to speak were a monument, not a multinational corporation. ExxonMobil, Valero, Halliburton. Each word landed like a gavel crack, deliberate, final, meant to leave no room for doubt. These are the engines of Texas prosperity, the bedrock of our economic might. They didn't ask for handouts. They built, they drilled, they hired. And now the left wants to paint them as villains? A murmur passed through the auditorium like static before a storm. Cruz didn't pause. He doubled down, his voice tightening with a lawyer's precision. "If we don't protect these investors, these builders, we don't just risk losing tax dollars. We risk losing the very soul of Texas. Do you think they'll stay if we keep smothering them with lawsuits and restrictions? Of course not. They'll pack up, head east, or worse, overseas. And the families who depend on those jobs? They'll be left behind, hungry, angry, forgotten." Applause surged, orchestrated and thunderous, from the right side of the room. It wasn't just polite agreement, it was tactical celebration. The camera panned across the sea of well-dressed businessmen, lobbyists, state-level GOP operatives, and oil-backed PAC sponsors. One man in a gray suit threw a fist in the air. Another gave a standing ovation, mouthing something like, "That's leadership." They grinned not because they were inspired, but because they recognized the art of survival. Cruz had fed them the gospel they needed, that profit was patriotism and accountability was heresy. But the camera didn't linger there. With a deliberate pan, it glided toward the back rows, where the lighting dimmed and the facade cracked. There, in the shadows of applause, sat the quiet casualties of Cruz's heroes. A refinery worker with faded tattoos on his forearms, the sleeves of his flannel rolled up to reveal patches of blistered, discolored skin, his body a living map of exposure. Next to him, a middle-aged black woman with calloused hands clutched her purse tightly to her chest, the edges of a prescription bottle peeking out. Her eyes didn't blink. 2 seats over, a young boy with a nasal cannula sat in his grandmother's lap, his chest rising and falling with a mechanical rhythm that didn't belong in a child. The grandmother wiped his brow, then looked up. Not at Cruz, but at Jasmine Crockett, as if silently asking, "Will you say something?" Jasmine didn't blink. She felt the applause roll past her like a wave trying to drown out something deeper. She could hear the sound of clapping, yes, but beneath it, she heard something more brutal. The silence of the sick who couldn't afford treatment, the coughs of children playing near chemical runoff, the slow erosion of communities built under smokestacks that never stopped spewing. Her fingers moved almost imperceptibly across the top edge of the folder. Leather-bound, scuffed at the corners, the folder wasn't a prop. It was a record, a reckoning. Inside, photographs of children with oxygen masks during recess. EPA reports buried under bureaucratic red tape. Transcripts of phone calls between Cruz's staffers and oil executives arranging policy alignment. Testimonies from school nurses treating asthma clusters within 5 miles of Halliburton's waste sites. It wasn't data, it was human evidence. And yet, Cruz continued, oblivious or indifferent. "We cannot let woke ideology hijack the conversation about our economy," he said, hammering the words like nails into a coffin. "If we let the radicals shame our industries, regulate our job creators into the ground, we won't have progress, we'll have poverty." Another round of applause, another flashbulb of fake triumph. But the camera lingered now, longer than expected, on a woman sitting dead center in the 3rd row. Her posture upright, her hands folded, her lips pressed in a thin, hard line. She wore a white church dress with a ribbon pinned to her chest, in memory of her son, who died 3 years earlier from a rare leukemia that spiked in her county after a chemical leak. She didn't flinch during Cruz's praise, she just stared, eyes wet but steel sharp, burning a hole into the space between Cruz's rhetoric and her reality. And still, Jasmine didn't move. Not yet. Timing mattered. In these moments, justice didn't shout. It waited. Because what Cruz had weaponized was not truth but scale. The scale of wealth, of media reach, of political armor. He didn't need to be right. He just needed to sound certain. Jasmine understood that all too well. She had walked into that studio knowing the deck was stacked, the narrative pre-scripted. She knew the moderators wouldn't interrupt him. She knew the sponsors of the program sat in the same room as the men who wrote the very tax breaks she was about to challenge. She wasn't surprised, but she was ready. She stared straight ahead, not at Cruz, not at the camera, but at the millions watching who had lived the consequences of his alliances. She didn't speak yet, but her silence began to cut through the noise. It wasn't weakness. It was sharpening. She was letting his story reach its peak so that, when it collapsed, it would collapse under the full weight of its own fiction. And somewhere deep in that auditorium, past the flashing cameras and the curated applause, past the suits and sound bites, a reckoning waited. Not in her tone, not in her anger, but in that folder, in the truth it held, in the cold, unfiltered ledger of who paid the price for Cruz's prosperity. And that ledger was about to be read. The silence that followed Cruz's rhetoric wasn't empty. It was electric, stretched taut over the room like the last breath before a lightning strike. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The weight of her next words was already pressing down on the air, and everyone in the studio, from the camera crew to the corporate donors in the front row, felt it. Her voice didn't rise. It dropped, low, deliberate, and sharp as a razor drawn from velvet. "If these corporations are the heroes of Texas," she said, each syllable cutting through the studio's glossy silence. Then who exactly are the victims? It was the kind of question that doesn't beg an answer. It demands a reckoning. Before anyone could recover from the blow, Jasmine reached forward and pressed a small button at the base of her microphone. Instantly, the towering LED screen behind the stage flickered to life. Gone were the sleek debate graphics and neutral backdrops. Now it showed a glowing satellite map of southeastern Texas. The audience leaned forward, some squinting, others holding their breath. The map zoomed in, block by block, zip code by zip code, until it locked onto Port Arthur, a coastal city just 90 miles east of Houston. Then slowly, a red haze began to spread across the map, thick, suffocating, and pulsing. "This is the air quality index," Jasmine said calmly, her eyes never leaving the screen. "Taken just 2 weeks ago in Port Arthur." The red zones covered schools, churches, public housing units. Jasmine stepped closer, pointing to a black circle outlined on the map. "This is the community center where Mrs. Gloria Evans held literacy classes for migrant children. It's also where her son started coughing blood at the age of 10. Doctors said it was acute bronchitis until the cancer diagnosis came a year later." She turned slightly, and the map changed again, now showing East Houston, overlaid with demographic data. The red was even thicker here, clustering over predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods like a wound that refused to heal. Jasmine's voice dipped even lower, steadier. "In these areas, levels of benzene, toluene, and xylene routinely exceed federal safety thresholds. These are neurotoxins, Senator. Not buzzwords, not media exaggerations, poison." Cruz shifted in his seat. For a brief second, his eyes darted to the screen, then to the moderator, then quickly away. But Jasmine wasn't finished. Another map appeared, this time color-coded by cancer rates per 10,000 residents. 3 out of the 5 most cancer-ridden zip codes in this entire state," she said, pausing between each word like she was nailing them into stone, "lie within 2 miles of refineries and chemical plants that receive direct tax subsidies, sponsored and approved by your office." There were no gasps now, no applause, just the clicking hum of cooling fans behind the cameras, and the slow realization washing over the audience that they were no longer watching a debate. They were witnessing a trial, and Ted Cruz was no longer the prosecutor. Jasmine turned from the screen and faced him fully now, her hands resting lightly on the folder she'd brought in, still unopened, still unread, but its weight was already doing the talking. "You said these corporations are heroes," she continued, her voice now filled with the kind of grief that refuses to become rage. "Because they create jobs, because they stimulate growth. But I want you to look those families in the eye. Families who've buried their children before their 15th birthdays, who've spent their savings on inhalers instead of tuition, who can't open their windows at night without coughing, and tell them this is the price of progress." The screen behind her changed again, this time to a photo, unfiltered and raw. A child lying in a hospital bed, his skin pale, his chest covered in adhesive patches, and his eyes half open. His name appeared below. Davon J. Martinez, age 7. Died from acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Lived 1.2 miles from a Valero refinery. Jasmine let the image linger. He didn't ask for lower gas prices. He asked if he could go back to school. Her tone didn't crack, but her body tensed, almost imperceptibly, as if holding back the full force of something vast. "And here's the truth, Senator," she said slowly. "He never had a choice. Because when the state gave those corporations tax breaks, they didn't just hand out incentives, they handed out immunity. Immunity from oversight, from responsibility, from consequences." For a long moment, Cruz said nothing. His fingers flexed once, then stilled. Jasmine looked past him now, toward the audience, toward the viewers at home, toward the unseen families watching this unfold with the same mix of anger and aching recognition. "You've called them job creators, but you never asked what kind of jobs. You never asked at what cost. And most of all, you never asked who gets to survive and who's left behind." Behind her, the screen faded to black. The room didn't move. No one applauded. The only sound was the quiet hum of the broadcast equipment, capturing every breathless second. Jasmine returned to her seat slowly, with the calmness of someone who didn't need to win the debate, because she had just ended the lie it was built on. The screen behind her faded to black, but its silence was louder than any applause. Jasmine's words had ruptured the illusion, laying bare a system built on quiet devastation and louder denial. The weight of her evidence still lingered in the air, coiled tightly in the space between audience and stage, fact and denial. It was the kind of silence that demanded response, not evasion. But Ted Cruz didn't answer with substance. He didn't even try. Instead, he leaned back in his chair with a smirk so rehearsed it might as well have been carved into granite. He folded his arms loosely, as if he were watching a child's tantrum instead of a woman presenting data that tied his policies to the suffering of thousands. Then came the scoff, sharp, dry, dismissive. "You know," Cruz said, tilting his head like a tired professor correcting a deluded student, "this is exactly what we've come to expect from your party." His tone dripped with condescension so thick it coated every syllable. Always blaming, always attacking, always allergic to success. He waved his hand, gesturing toward the invisible world of business leaders and oil executives he claimed to represent. Texas thrives not because of complaints, but because of capitalism. And what does the other side bring? Marxist fairy tales dressed up in designer suits. He turned, locking eyes with her for the first time all night, but there was no sincerity behind it, only performance. "Let's be clear," he continued, louder now, feeding off the discomfort in the room. "What we have here is a modern-day Marxist, but not in overalls or holding a picket sign. No, this one comes in heels and a tailored blazer, quoting EPA reports like scripture and hoping we mistake that for wisdom." He chuckled. Then, with one final twist of the knife, "A revolutionary in stilettos." Laughter erupted from the right side of the studio, but it was hollow. Less joy, more tribal instinct. Men in suits slapped one another's backs. A row of campaign donors leaned in, smiling smugly as if Jasmine had confirmed every cynical assumption they held about politicians who dared to speak for the voiceless. The moderator didn't intervene. The cameras didn't blink. The system, built to mock what it feared, played its role perfectly. And yet, for all the noise, not a single graph had been challenged. Not a single health report refuted. Not a single chemical level disputed. Cruz hadn't answered her question. He had dodged it with theater, replacing science with sarcasm, grief with gimmicks. Jasmine sat still, but her jaw tightened slightly, just enough for anyone truly watching to see. Her eyes scanned the room, but she wasn't looking for validation. She was measuring the depth of a wound Cruz had just made wider. Because this wasn't about her ego. It wasn't even about his cruelty. It was about every person she carried into that room, every victim dismissed, every community sacrificed, every body buried beneath success. The crowd's laughter swelled, but its echo was already beginning to sound like desperation. And under that rising tide of jeers and applause, Jasmine Crockett didn't shrink. She sharpened. But while the crowd howled with laughter and Cruz soaked in the energy of cheap applause, Jasmine Crockett did not blink. She didn't lean forward. She didn't flinch. Instead, she reached slowly, like drawing a blade from its sheath, toward the thick leather-bound folder that had sat unopened all night, heavy with purpose and patience. Her hands moved with the certainty of someone who wasn't there to win an argument, but to expose a transaction. The air shifted. Laughter dimmed, not from shame, but from unease. Everyone in the room, donors, staffers, executives, interns, sensed something was coming that couldn't be laughed away. Jasmine unlaced the brass clasps on the folder, the sound of metal striking leather, impossibly loud in the silence. She pulled out a single document, oversized, thick cardstock, not flimsy printer paper. Every line printed in bold, every number traceable. She didn't speak immediately. She stood. Let them see it. Let them read the heading at the top in clear black ink. Campaign Contributions to Senator Rafael Edward Cruz, 2021 to 2024. Entities under active EPA investigation or federal litigation. Then her voice came, measured, steady, as sharp as a courtroom verdict. "You called me a Marxist. You said I hate success. You told the world I want to punish companies that build America. Her gaze locked on Cruz, her tone not accusatory but surgical. Fine. Then tell me what to do with this. She turned to the camera now, holding up the document like evidence entered into public record. $1,750,000. That's how much your campaign received in the past 3 years from just 4 corporations. 4, not 20, not 50. 4. Her voice didn't rise. It tightened, each syllable landing like a steel gavel. And what do all 4 have in common? She turned back toward the screen, which now displayed the logos in stark contrast against a black background. With a single tap of her remote, Jasmine brought the numbers to life. $425,000 from Valero Energy, $320,000 from LyondellBasell Industries, $500,000 from Chevron Phillips Chemical Company, and $505,000 from Flint Hills Resources. Each dollar a receipt of silence, each contribution tied directly to pollution, litigation, and political protection. She walked slowly across the stage, not for drama, but for clarity. Each of these companies is currently under EPA investigation or has settled lawsuits for violations of the Clean Air Act in the state of Texas. 3 have been cited in the past 18 months alone for illegal toxic dumping. 2 paid settlements without admitting fault. All 4 operate within a 5-mile radius of the neighborhoods with the highest cancer rates in the state. The screen now split side-by-side images. On the left, a glossy press photo of Cruz shaking hands with an executive at an energy conference. On the right, a photo of a young boy lying in a hospital bed, bald from chemotherapy, staring blankly past the camera. The contrast didn't need narration, but Jasmine gave it anyway. Senator Cruz, she said slowly, her voice low and almost intimate, as if the room had vanished. You say you protect jobs. You say you protect Texans. But these corporations weren't donating to protect workers. They were buying silence, influence, protection from accountability, and they got what they paid for. A beat of stillness. Then she turned to the audience. I don't care if you're a Republican, Democrat, Independent, Texan or not. Look me in the eye and tell me that a system where a senator can take nearly $2 million from companies that are actively poisoning the air and water of Black and brown communities is not corruption. No one laughed. No one clapped. The entire right side of the audience, once smug, arms crossed, full of snickers and nods, was suddenly motionless. Some looked down. Some checked their phones, desperate for distraction. The moderator didn't cut in. The producers behind the glass said nothing. Jasmine stepped forward one more time and placed the document on the desk in front of Cruz. The move was gentle, but it struck like a hammer. You asked for receipts, she said quietly. I brought ledgers. Her final words fell with the weight of closing iron doors. This isn't ideology. This is arithmetic soaked in blood. And just like that, the room changed. Not with noise, but with absence. The absence of applause. The absence of Cruz's smirk. The absence of denial. In that stillness, it was no longer about party lines or political theater. It was about numbers, names, patterns of death repeated for profit, and now finally televised. And just as the weight of Jasmine's accusations left the room breathless, no rebuttal, no deflection, just the raw exposure of truth laid bare, she turned slowly to the moderator and gave a single, deliberate nod. No words, no announcement, just a signal. The lights in the studio dimmed with cinematic precision, the LED backdrop flickering to black. A single spotlight faded in from stage left, and under its harsh glow emerged a figure who had no title, no power, no voice in the halls of Washington. But tonight she carried something heavier than politics. Her name was Marisol Herrera, and the story written across her face would become the most devastating testimony of the evening. She walked slowly toward the center of the stage, her boots scuffing softly across the floor. The denim jacket she wore hung loose on her shoulders, worn thin at the seams. In one hand, she held a laminated photo curled from repeated folding. In the other, a yellow prescription bag, empty, flattened, faded. She was in her late 30s, but looked older, worn by fatigue not of labor, but of heartbreak. The audience quieted to something deeper than silence. It was the stillness of people realizing they were about to witness something they couldn't unhear. Marisol stepped to the mic. Her voice when it came was soft, unsure at first, like it didn't belong in a room full of lights and cameras. "My name is Marisol Herrera," she said, her hands trembling. "I'm a mother. I live in Hillcrest, just outside Corpus Christi, 2 blocks from the Flint Hills Resources Plant." She paused, the words catching in her throat. "I didn't come here to talk politics. I came because my son Diego is dying." A murmur passed through the audience, but it died as quickly as it came. Marisol held up the photo in her hand. A boy, 11 years old, dark curls, wide smile, missing one front tooth. "This is him. Before. Before the coughing started. Before the ER visits. Before he couldn't breathe lying down. Before they told me it was stage 2 lung cancer." Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. "My son has never smoked a day in his life. He's never even seen a cigarette. But every morning he woke up to the stench of ammonia and gas drifting through our windows. Every night he went to sleep under a sky the color of rust." She turned then, slowly, deliberately, toward Ted Cruz. The spotlight caught the glint of tears along her cheekbone, but her voice steadied. "While I was sitting beside his hospital bed, watching chemo strip the hair from his scalp and strength from his bones, you were in Cancun, not helping, not visiting, not even calling." Cancun. Her voice rose, not in volume, but in fire. "And you paid for that trip with money from the same companies that bleed into our water, leak into our lungs, and settle into the soil beneath our playgrounds." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a stack of medical bills bound by a rubber band. Some printed, others handwritten with "past due" scrawled across them in red marker. "I had to quit my job to take care of him. The diner let me go after too many missed shifts. My rent is 3 months behind. His pain meds cost more than my car." Her hands shook as she held the bills high. "But the men who gave you those checks, they're building new wings on their headquarters." The camera zoomed in, capturing every line in her face, every ounce of exhausted fury etched into her expression. "You say they create jobs. What kind of job lets a child die for breathing? You say they bring opportunity. What kind of opportunity leaves me begging for oxygen refills and rationing food stamps so I can afford his nausea meds?" She paused, her voice now barely above a whisper. "He asked me last week if dying hurts. I didn't know what to say. I told him no. I lied." Then she did something no one expected. She stepped forward, pointed at Ted Cruz, and her voice turned to steel. "You let this happen, not with your hands, but with your votes, with your silence, with your deals behind closed doors. You chose them. You chose money. You chose campaign checks over my child's lungs, over my nights without sleep, over my son's future that you helped erase." The room was frozen. Even the studio crew behind the glass had stopped moving. Cruz sat rigid, his jaw locked, his eyes refusing to meet hers. The audience, once so loud with mock applause and cheap laughter, now stared at their own feet, their expressions hollow. Marisol took one last breath. "You said earlier that these companies built Texas. But I have news for you, Senator. Texas is dying, and it's not from policy. It's from poison, the kind they pour into our neighborhoods, and the kind you pour into our laws." She lowered the photo, tucked the prescription bag back into her jacket, and turned away. No dramatic exit, no bow, just a mother, walking off stage the same way she came in. Exhausted, heartbroken, and more powerful than any lobbyist in that building. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't have to. Marisol had just said everything, and in the suffocating stillness that followed, not even a senator could breathe. The studio air, already thick with the gravity of Marisol's testimony, now hung heavy with an unbearable silence. There was nothing performative about the quiet. It was the stillness that follows impact, the kind that settles in the chest and does not let go. For one long moment, no one spoke. Even the harsh lighting above seemed to dim under the weight of her truth. Ted Cruz, motionless for the duration of her story, sat hunched slightly forward, his jaw tight, lips drawn into a thin line that didn't signal shame, but calculation. He could feel the cameras still rolling, the audience still stunned, the country watching. His silence wasn't out of reflection. It was strategy. And when he finally did speak, it wasn't careful. It was catastrophic. He leaned in, breaking the spell not with compassion, but with defiance. "Let me be clear," he began, his voice louder now, cutting against the fragile stillness like a buzzsaw through glass. "I am not responsible for the individual choices made by every family in Texas." The words dropped like stones in water. No nuance, no empathy, just raw political distance. Gasps rippled across the audience, not theatrical, but involuntary. Cruz continued, his tone sharper now, like a man backed into a corner, choosing the only weapon left: blame reversal. "I can't answer for every health issue, every lifestyle, every environmental scare tactic people want to pin on me. I legislate for the state, not for emotional outbursts." The words were brutal in their dismissal, the subtext screaming louder than the sentence itself. Their pain isn't my problem. The mother who had just shared her son's battle with cancer? An outlier. The poison communities? Not his concern. The fact that he had taken nearly $2 million from companies at the heart of those tragedies? Not relevant, not now, not ever. His tone was not just defensive, it was disdainful, as if acknowledging their suffering would be a concession too costly for his political armor. He didn't just deflect responsibility. He rejected the very premise that accountability could be expected of him. And then he stopped talking. No apology, no clarification. He leaned back as if he had just said something noble, as if the absence of empathy was the real strength in the room. But something shifted. The audience didn't erupt in support. No applause followed. Even the few loyalists who had clapped earlier now looked sideways, unsure if what they had just heard was strategy or self-destruction. In the control room, producers looked at each other, mouths agape. The audio technician whispered into his headset, "Did he just say that?" Within seconds, one of the interns had clipped the moment and hit upload. The clip spread like wildfire. The words, frozen in time, hit social media with a force even Cruz couldn't spin away from. "I'm not responsible for the decisions made by every individual family in Texas." The backlash was immediate and merciless. On X, formerly Twitter, number "not my responsibility" began trending within 6 minutes. On TikTok, creators began stitching Marisol's tearful testimony with Cruz's words, captioned with lines like, "This is what denial looks like, and how much is a child's life worth in campaign donations." By the time the broadcast returned from commercial break, the phrase had already made it into headlines on MSNBC, CNN, and even Fox News, where one commentator, visibly uncomfortable, admitted, "That didn't land well." But it wasn't just politics that reacted, it was people. Parents across the country, mothers, fathers, aunts, uncles, began uploading videos holding photos of their sick children, whispering into the camera, "We made decisions to live, and you made decisions to look away." Cancer survivors held up their hospital bracelets beside screenshots of Cruz's quote. ER nurses from East Texas posted anonymous testimonials about air quality spikes, asthma surges, and cancer clusters, pointing directly to the corporations Cruz had defended. Jasmine Crockett sat motionless during the wave. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Cruz had handed her something she could never manufacture, a confession disguised as arrogance, and the public heard it for what it was. Not a denial of guilt, but a rejection of humanity. Somewhere in the back row, Marisol was still seated, her son's photo clutched in her lap. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. Her eyes weren't wet. She didn't need to cry again. The country was already crying with her, and Ted Cruz, who had tried to make this about politics, had just lost control of the story. He had shown the world not just his policies, but his priorities. And no soundbite, no spin room, no press secretary could put that back in the bottle. And just as the studio buzzed with the aftershock of Cruz's cold refusal to take responsibility, just as social media boiled and the eyes of the nation turned like spotlights onto that stage, Jasmine Crockett moved again, this time with the weight of something final. She reached back into her leather folder, deeper this time, her fingers sliding between thick layers of evidence until she found what she had waited the entire night to reveal. Her hand emerged holding a plain, white envelope, unmarked except for a red tab clipped to the side. The studio lights seemed to flicker for a moment, not literally, but in the way tension distorts perception. No one breathed. Jasmine stood slowly, deliberately, and walked to the edge of the stage where the primary screen loomed large and unblinking. This isn't a theory. It's not an accusation. It's not a partisan point, she said, voice low, almost gentle, which somehow made it even more dangerous. It's a record, a conversation, a transaction that shouldn't exist. With one smooth motion, she pulled the red tab. A page projected onto the screen behind her, and in bold black text at the top it read, Internal email. Subject, Strategic Policy Concessions linked to Q3 funding. The timestamp, June 3rd, 2023, 9:14 p.m. Sender, Ryan McKellar, Senior Policy Advisor, Office of Senator Ted Cruz. Recipient, Douglas Finch, VP of Government Relations, Prairie Ridge Chemical Group. She didn't need to read the whole email. The audience already leaned forward, the silence turning into gravity. But Jasmine did anyway. Calm, clear, unflinching. As discussed, we remain committed to preserving regulatory exemptions for Category B emissions through the upcoming budget resolution. In exchange, your team's Q3 contribution, as outlined, will be processed through the PAC channel by end of month. Language will mirror prior cycles. Keep it clean, Ryan. Jasmine looked back to the crowd, letting the words hang. Acidic, undeniable, damning. This isn't just corruption. This is policy for sale. Her eyes narrowed. And it's not abstract. It's not hypothetical. It's lung disease. It's leukemia. It's a mother quitting her job while her senator books a flight to Cancun with the money he got for letting kids breathe poison. She turned, stepped toward Cruz's desk. Her voice, still calm, dropped lower, a blade behind velvet. What exactly is this, Senator? A memo of understanding? She raised the paper. Or a betrayal signed in silence? She walked closer. You didn't just take their money. You gave them immunity. You let them write loopholes while our children's lungs filled with ash. Her tone never cracked, but it was iron now, and it rang across the studio. So tell me, what is this? She held up the email. A contract or a confession? The screen zoomed in on the bottom of the email, an innocuous closing line that now read like a chilling epitaph. Keep it clean, Ryan. The camera cut to Cruz. His face, so controlled for so long, so practiced, was pale now, his jaw slack, his mouth slightly open like a man who'd just taken a punch he never saw coming. He blinked once, twice. His hands moved to his tie, adjusting it even though it didn't need adjusting. The flush of fight was gone. The arrogance was gone. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Every word would be dissected, every twitch televised. And the studio felt it, all of it. The producers behind the glass didn't cut to commercial. They leaned in. The moderator didn't intervene. He swallowed hard and looked down at his notes, suddenly insignificant. Even the studio audience, now sitting like jurors at a sentencing, knew what had just happened. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was the unveiling of a ledger soaked in politics and stained with complicity. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She returned to center stage, turned toward the national camera, the one streaming directly to tens of millions across the country, and held up the document once more, this time to the nation, not the man. This is how it works, she said, not with anger, but clarity. You wonder why your child can't breathe? Why your water smells like chemicals? Why the asthma wards are full? This is why. Because the people writing the rules aren't thinking about your family. They're writing checks. They're answering emails like this. And when it all falls apart, they say, I'm not responsible. She stepped back, letting the truth have the full stage. But we are, all of us. If we let this continue, if we normalize this as just politics, then we are complicit. She placed the email face up on the moderator's desk. Let the public read every word. The room didn't erupt in applause. It didn't need to. That moment was not built for cheering. It was built for reckoning, for memory, for change. And as the camera lingered on Cruz's face, still blank, still pale, still searching for words that had abandoned him, the country understood. What just happened could not be undone. Not with spin, not with tweets, not with deflection. Because Jasmine hadn't made a claim. She had made a case. And the evidence was undeniable. And as the camera lingered on Ted Cruz's frozen face, pale, slack, stripped of its usual fire, the broadcast faded to black. But the reckoning had only just begun. Within minutes of the debate ending, newsroom phones from D.C. to New York lit up like a five-alarm fire. Editors barked orders across open floors. Producers scrambled for footage. By midnight, it was no longer a political debate. It was a national incident. CNN cut in live at 12:04 a.m., the headline in thick red letters, "Crockett drops evidence, bomb in live debate, Cruz on defense." Less than an hour later, MSNBC aired a full segment comparing the email Jasmine revealed to the worst moments of Watergate. The New York Times, rarely one for dramatic phrasing, ran a midnight edition headline that read simply, "A reckoning in real time." Beneath it, in smaller print, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett turns the tide with evidence of policy for donation coordination. Clips of the email flashed across every platform. TikTok flooded with videos overlaying Jasmine's calm, devastating line, "A contract or a betrayal?" against images of children with oxygen masks, refinery stacks glowing under polluted skies, and Cruz turning white under the stage lights. On X, the hashtag Crockett effect trended globally by sunrise, and a 3-second GIF of Cruz adjusting his tie with trembling fingers had already crossed 27 million views. Even Fox News in its 3 a.m. slot couldn't avoid it. An anchor tried to redirect blame toward theatrical editing, but the raw footage left no room for spin. The damage was done, and it wasn't just a bruise. It was blood in the water. By 7:45 a.m., less than 10 hours after the debate, Ted Cruz was standing behind a hastily assembled podium outside his Houston office. The seal of the U.S. Senate hung awkwardly behind him, flanked by 2 uneasy aides and a grim-faced communications director. The media swarmed, journalists elbowing for position, microphones shoved past each other, cameras stacked 3 deep. Cruz adjusted the same tie he had fidgeted with the night before and forced a tight smile that fooled no one. "I want to make one thing clear," he began, voice already cracking beneath the weight of his own urgency. "There was no quid pro quo, no illegal coordination. These accusations are politically motivated and timed to smear a conservative voice." But no one was buying it. A CNN reporter shouted, "Then what did 'keep it clean' Ryan mean?" Cruz looked down. A New York Times journalist followed up, "Will you release full correspondence with Prairie Ridge Chemical Group?" Cruz ignored the question. A local Houston paper asked flatly, "Did you profit politically from EPA exemption deals?" Cruz blinked, adjusted the mic, and pivoted. "Let me be clear. I fight for Texas jobs." The words sounded hollow now, rehearsed and recycled. He continued talking, but no one was listening. The live feed had already cut away. The nation had heard enough. Behind the scenes, the political machinery had already begun to move. Just hours after the press conference, Senate Minority Leader Charles Schumer released a brief but blistering statement. "We are calling for an immediate bipartisan review of all recent campaign donations tied to deregulation efforts in Texas. The integrity of this chamber cannot be sold, certainly not for $1.75 million. By noon, Senator Elizabeth Warren and Senator Sheldon Whitehouse had co-sponsored a motion to initiate a select committee on political influence and environmental harm, targeting the flow of dark money through deregulation pipelines. Journalists nicknamed it the Clean Air Inquiry, but everyone knew what it really was: the Cruz investigation. Lobbyists close to Prairie Ridge Chemical began going silent. Legal departments went into lockdown. Cruz's office issued 3 vague press releases in 6 hours, none of which answered the central question. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett remained composed, silent, and strategic. She didn't do a press tour. She didn't gloat. She simply tweeted a screenshot of the email with one sentence beneath it: "The truth doesn't need to shout." The tweet garnered 4.2 million likes in under 12 hours. By evening, political analysts were already drawing comparisons to watershed moments: McCarthy's fall, the Pentagon Papers, even Enron. But this one had something different. It was personal, tangible, live-streamed. You couldn't call it hearsay when the whole world had heard it. You couldn't dismiss the documents when they were zoomed in frame by frame, shared by millions, analyzed by experts, and burned into the memory of anyone with a conscience. Ted Cruz, once unshakable in his ideological armor, now faced more than bad optics. He faced questions from the very institution he thought he could outmaneuver. A formal investigation, subpoenas, depositions, and perhaps, if the committee did its job right, consequences that could echo beyond career. But Jasmine Crockett didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She had already said everything that mattered, and now the system itself would have to answer. And as the Senate prepared for hearings and pundits battled over airwaves, Jasmine Crockett left the noise behind. She wasn't interested in panels or polls. She wasn't chasing headlines. She returned to the place where the cost of corruption wasn't measured in approval ratings, but in oxygen tanks, in empty desks at school, in the silence left behind by children who never got the chance to grow up. That place was Port Arthur, and the church she stood in now was barely holding together. The white paint on the siding had peeled into curls. The wooden beams creaked with every wind gust from the Gulf, and the stained glass windows bore more cracks than colors. But the pews were full, because pain fills space more easily than hope. Jasmine stood alone at the altar. No teleprompter, no aides, no stagecraft. Just her and the breathless quiet of a room full of people who had buried too much and been ignored too long. The air smelled of lemon oil and old hymn books, but under that, just barely, there was something acrid. Residue from decades of invisible gas leaks, chemical mist that had long seeped into wood, lungs, and memory. She placed her hands gently on the pulpit. Her voice didn't thunder. It anchored. They told us to wait, told us to be patient, told us it wasn't time yet, she said. But while they were stalling, our children were dying. While they were debating legislation in climate-controlled chambers, you were wrapping your kids in wet towels to keep the fumes out of their throats. A hush followed, deep and full of memory. Heads nodded, hands tightened. She looked down to the first pew, where Diego, a boy of 11, sat with his mother. He was small for his age, with hollow cheeks and a surgical port tucked just under his hoodie. Tubing ran from his nostrils to a compact oxygen tank beside his feet, making a quiet, constant hiss like a whisper no one could ignore. His mother sat upright, her eyes rimmed red but dry. Too tired to cry, too proud to break. Jasmine stepped away from the pulpit and walked toward them. She held a thick envelope wrapped in a blue silk ribbon. The audience held its breath. "This is for Diego," she said, kneeling down so she could meet the boy at eye level. "It's a full scholarship for medical school, for transportation, for treatments, for breathing, for fighting, for living." Her voice cracked slightly, just once, but she steadied herself. "It's not a gift. It's not charity. It's justice. Long overdue." Diego looked at the envelope like it was made of fire. His small hands trembled as he took it, his mouth open in disbelief. He didn't speak, but Jasmine could see it in his eyes. Relief so overwhelming it looked like fear. She placed her hand gently on his shoulder, then rose. Back at the altar, Jasmine exhaled slowly. "I wish I could give this to every child hurt by the greed we just exposed. But what I can do," she continued, voice rising just enough to shake the rafters, "is make sure the system that poisoned him will never be allowed to do it again." The crowd leaned in. These weren't voters. These were survivors. And Jasmine didn't offer promises. She offered a reckoning. "We have allowed a system to form," she said, pacing slowly across the narrow platform, "where decisions are made not by science, not by justice, but by checks passed in closed rooms, where exemptions are traded like baseball cards and communities like this one become sacrifice zones." Her voice hardened, but she didn't yell. She didn't need to. "That is not policy. That is predation. And the people cashing in on it, they know your names, but they don't speak them." She stopped, looked at the congregation, looked at the children, then lowered her voice to a near whisper. "But I do. I know your names. I see you. I have walked through these streets and smelled the same air. And I promise you this. I will carry your stories into every room they've tried to keep you out of. I will read your names into the congressional record if I have to scream them from the floor of the House." Applause started, quiet at first, just one set of hands, then another, then dozens. Not explosive, but rising, steady, earned. But Jasmine raised a hand, not to stop it, but to ask for something more. I want you to remember this moment, she said, because justice doesn't come from applause. It comes from accountability, and that is what we're demanding. Not just in this town, not just in Texas, but everywhere pollution has been sold as progress and survival has been framed as entitlement. She looked around the church, at cracked windows, oxygen tanks, folded invoices peeking out of purses, weary men with calloused hands and eyes like dark wells of memory. And then she asked the one question that silenced even the clapping. If we don't stop dirty money from steering our democracy, she paused, voice a dagger wrapped in velvet, then whose life will be the next cost of doing business? It landed like thunder, not a sound, not a shuffle, only the breathless stillness of a town that had finally heard what it had waited a lifetime to hear. Not from a politician, but from a witness who had finally become a weapon. The cameras faded to black, but the moment refused to die. Even after the lights dimmed and the audience dispersed in stunned silence, something in the air refused to settle. What Jasmine had spoken, what she had claimed, wasn't just a defense. It was a declaration. And declarations, when delivered in the right voice, have a way of echoing far beyond the room in which they are spoken. By morning, she was everywhere. Clips from the final 2 minutes of the broadcast exploded across social media, not with outrage, but with awe. Her final words, delivered with ice and fire in equal measure, now looped endlessly with the kind of reverence usually reserved for prophets or revolutionaries. If fighting for equality makes me the race card queen, people didn't just quote it, they branded it, wore it, graffitied it on the walls of cities still aching from buried names. In Chicago, a muralist painted Jasmine's likeness 6 stories high, her eyes staring straight out onto the west side, the words "Long live the crown" etched in gold across the bricks beside her. In Brooklyn, a vendor on Fulton Street sold black hoodies stamped with her silhouette and the title that was meant to bury her. Race Card Queen. The font was jagged, almost violent, but under it sat a single line of quiet rebellion. Silence is what keeps injustice alive. At UC Berkeley, a packed auditorium fell silent as Jasmine entered, not because of fame, but because of gravity. She walked onto the stage not like a politician, but like someone who had just survived a battle and emerged without a single word to apologize for. Students rose instinctively. Professors wept. And when she spoke, she didn't recount the interview. She dissected it. She turned the night's anatomy into curriculum. What you saw on that stage, she said, wasn't an argument, it was extraction. Extraction of dignity, extraction of narrative. And I answered not just for myself, but for every mother still waiting for the apology this system has no language for. At Howard University, her name became a chant before her feet even touched the podium. 1,000 black students stood with fists raised as Jasmine stepped forward, the stage vibrating beneath their feet. Behind her, a banner stretched the width of the auditorium. Not a card, not a queen, a witness. And still, she refused to celebrate. Because the truth that made her famous wasn't new. It had always been there, buried under press releases, redacted in court filings, drowned out by commentators who spoke louder than they listened. The only difference now was that the world had been forced to look, and they didn't just see Jasmine. They saw themselves, their mothers, their neighbors, their mugshots, their missed chances, their unburied rage. Everywhere she went, people brought her stories. A woman handed her a folded letter with a photo of her brother who had been wrongfully incarcerated for a crime he didn't commit. 12 years served, 2 words uttered in return: clerical error. A college athlete pressed a copy of his student conduct file into her hands, marked with accusations he had never been allowed to contest. A veteran in Detroit, standing in a food bank line, whispered to her, "They called me a hero in Baghdad and a thug in Baltimore." She listened. She always listened, because the crown they placed on her head was forged from the weight of the unheard. She didn't ask for it, but she refused to let it collect dust on a pedestal. And the media? They scrambled to catch up. Outlets that once labeled her combative now struggled for words that didn't taste like hypocrisy. One major news network aired a special titled The Reckoning of Language, examining how coded terms like race card had been used to delegitimize voices for decades. Journalists who once ignored her inbox now sent desperate requests for interviews, asking if she would clarify her position or share her insights on race in media. She declined most of them. "I've said what I came to say," she told one editorial board, her voice even. "You just weren't listening before the cameras turned on." And yet, despite the surge of attention, she never lost the scar tissue that built her. She remembered the first time she was called too loud in a courtroom for asking why her client's file was missing. She remembered the breath she had to hold after being told her tone was too emotional during a sentencing appeal for a teenager the system had already given up on. She remembered the years she spent crafting arguments with the precision of a surgeon, only to watch them be dismissed as rants the moment she stepped out of line. That was the weight behind her voice on that stage. That was the pain they hadn't clipped into sound bites. And now the title they'd used to try to reduce her, Race Card Queen, had become something else entirely. It became a symbol not of division, but defiance. Not of grievance, but grief, refined, rechanneled, renamed. It became the title etched onto signs at protests in Philadelphia, woven into spoken word poems in South LA, and whispered between daughters and mothers who had both been stopped, searched, and silenced. It was stitched into fabric, carved into murals, spray painted beneath bridges, printed on pins, tattooed on skin. Not for her ego, but for their memory. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't just survive the ambush. She claimed the crown they forged for her in malice, and she turned it into a monument they could never tear down. And as Jasmine Crockett's voice faded into the stained glass silence of that church in Port Arthur, the lesson was not finished, it was only beginning. Because recognition, no matter how raw or powerful, is not enough. Awareness without action is just memory with no muscle. Jasmine hadn't come merely to bear witness. She came to ignite. And what she ignited wasn't rage. It was responsibility. Her words did not settle. They summoned. And as the congregation stood in reverent silence, hearts pounding beneath years of smothered grief and quiet resignation, there was one truth that rang louder than everything else. Change will not come unless we force it into being. Not by waiting, not by wishing, but by standing, shoulder to shoulder, breath to breath, and choosing to rise. Jasmine stepped forward one final time, not behind the pulpit now, but directly in front of the crowd. Her voice was steady, but it carried an urgency that could not be ignored. "If we walk out of here today and do nothing," she said, scanning every eye in the room, "then the next Diego, the next mother holding a folded diagnosis, the next child wheezing in a classroom built too close to a smokestack, will already be condemned." She paused, letting the weight of that sentence burn into the air. "That's what these corporations are counting on. That we will grieve quietly. That we will rage in private. That we will bow our heads, bury our dead, and forget." Her voice sharpened, like the edge of a rising tide. "But I didn't come here for silence. I came for a reckoning. And now I'm asking you, not just as citizens, but as survivors, to rise with me. Because the war isn't over. The headlines may fade, but the air in your lungs, the water in your taps, the poison in your soil, they don't vanish when the cameras do. And the men who profited from your pain, they're already writing the next exemption." She stepped closer to the front rows now, almost whispering, but the power in her words hit like thunder. "So what do? We fight. Not with fists, but with facts, with ballots, with voices. We show up to town halls. We demand full disclosure from our elected officials. We call out the deals made in the dark and drag them into the light. And we do it together, because a single voice can be dismissed, but an army of the unheard cannot be silenced." She turned to the boy she had given the scholarship to, Diego, still gripping the envelope like it contained oxygen. "This is what we owe them. Not pity, protection, not sadness. Action." Then she looked out at the sea of faces, filled not with fear now, but with a storm gathering just behind their eyes. "You were never voiceless," she said. "You were just unheard. Now let them hear you." The room stirred, not wildly, but with conviction. Heads began to nod. People began to rise. Jasmine's tone dropped again, lower, more intimate, but more dangerous for its stillness. I want you to register, not next week, today. I want you to knock on your neighbors' doors. I want you to show up at every school board, every zoning meeting, every place they assume you're too tired, too sick, or too poor to be, because that's what they bet on. They bet on your exhaustion. They bet on your heartbreak. They bet on your silence. Now make them lose. She lifted her hand slowly, not in victory, but in solidarity. This fight doesn't end with me, she said. It begins with you, with every single person who refuses to let their pain be monetized, with every family who refuses to bury another child because a senator needed a donation, with every community that refuses to be poisoned so someone else can profit. The church erupted, not in noise but in motion. People stood. People wept. People reached for one another, not because they were broken, but because they were ready. Jasmine's voice rose over it all, measured, fierce, immortal. You want to change the system? She asked. Become the storm they never saw coming. That was the call, and the world heard it. Now it must answer. As the congregation surged to its feet, something sacred ignited. Not just hope, but resolve. The kind of resolve born not in comfort, but in fire. Outside, the wind rustled through the oaks like an ancient drumbeat, and from within those cracked church walls, a movement was taking shape. Not on television, not in polished speeches, but in ordinary people who had finally remembered their power. Some held hands. Others clutched photos of loved ones lost to illnesses that no doctor could cure, because the real sickness was written into law. And yet in that moment, they were no longer grieving. They were gathering. Jasmine stood among them now, no longer on a platform but in the crowd, shoulder to shoulder with those she'd come to fight for. Her final words weren't shouted. They were spoken like a vow. Every empire built on suffering will fall, but only if we push. Only if we stay loud when they beg for silence. Only if we remember that justice is not given. It's taken back. The room didn't roar. It thrummed, like thunder in the chest, like a heartbeat waking up after years of being muffled. And then the doors opened. People didn't trickle out. They marched into sunlight, into headlines, into history. Not because a hero had spoken, but because someone had dared to say what so many had been dying to believe. We are not helpless. We are not voiceless. And now, we are no longer waiting. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.